Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Michael Springer, who is a software engineer at JazzHR. Michael joins us today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. Michael Springer, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, maintainable software code?
Some things I'd like to consider for maintainable software are ease of, picking it up, as a lot of us have probably encountered. You go to a new place and you get thrown into a code base and it could be a behemoth to try to understand. And I think that kind of comes from both the area of, is it well documented, or is the code organized in such a way that you're able to search things because they have meaningful names, they have patterns that actually, make sense. I know people like to over abstract things, and that can work if you definitely adhere to the object-oriented paradigms, but sometimes people will go a little too far in the deep end, and we all know that most software that follows OOP is more like 50 applications that contain OOP all stitched together.
You mentioned ease of picking it up. How long has it been since you've joined an organization or a code base that was new to you but had been around for a while?
It'd probably be about 6 years at this point.
Okay. If you're thinking about the software projects that you're working on, what sort of strategies have you seen work in terms of helping make it to improve the ease of onboarding and the simplifying the ability for a newcomer to a project to wrap their head around the software project or the business logic or understanding the system?
I think it's been how the project itself is decomposed. If it's been broken down into modules that have some coherence to what is presented to the end user, in cases of modules for settings or person profiles, you can take a guess sometimes and just say, I want to look for any classes that have person profile or, user settings or admin panel, and structuring your code in such a way that it almost corresponds to the URL structure, if it's a web app, or just kind of sticking to the logical sense of the call chain and not this weird behemoth where you have a class that contains every single thing and the naming is not exactly what it is on the front end versus what it is in the back end, which that's a personal experience I've had where a project has changed names and it's actually been confusing to upkeep because in one area of the app, it'll refer to it as screening, but then in the original iteration of the project, it was just called a background check. And so now you have this differentiation of naming, which you need to keeping that consistent can also greatly improve the whole onboarding procedure and future iterations of maintaining it.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's an easy example for those listening to wrap your head around is whether or not you have a user's model or a user model or something, right? And you might have a user's table, but does everybody in your organization call the people that are interacting with the application users, or are there a certain type of user? And then so that sometimes those classes can end up becoming, you might use single table inheritance or something like that, where you end up having people or customers, admins, or you break those out at some point. But I think you make a good point about other areas of the organization or the applications where the things themselves, it's a background screening or I think the background check or screening, that example you use there. Do you find that the communication that they're using on the public or the end user side of things that's influencing that? We internally called it this, but the customers or the public or the consumers that are interacting with the application refer to it a little bit differently, so we want to match it there. But or does the internal organization outside of just the coders also change how they talk about it? But they're like, well, we say this, but publicly we mean that. And so that becomes like a weird translation challenge between whether it's marketing copy versus, like how the operational side of the business kind of perceives that information.
Yeah, it's like a really good question. I found in organizations I've worked in and currently work in, a lot of the initial naming is driven by what the product and marketing team wants to refer to it as. And in the cases where their position on what it should be presented as changes, that can influence either confusion, where we decide to change the naming like part way, or if you happen to have like a refactor at some point that's like, oh, we're going to, change the public visible name to something, but then all of the controllers are going to be the old name. And so future engineers are going to come in and just be, super confused.
And the solution there tends to be, do you have some form of like a large glossary list somewhere that kind of says, well, this means this in this department and this other department refers to it as this, and publicly it means this. In the code, it may mean one of these three things. That's been something that I've witnessed a number of times on projects that we've worked on where our clients will be, well, they're talking about things and they'll be putting in a JIRA ticket for like, we want to work on this new feature or need to improve some reporting, or like that. These names of things don't match anything in your code whatsoever. So what do you think that used to mean 6 years ago when this was first built? And sometimes the people that are even like onboarding people that aren't, say, software developers can be a challenge within an organization because of the same glossary changes or a lack of maintaining something like that, or making the change consistently throughout the whole system.
Right. Because it's not just especially when you're working in an end user product, like naming is not just pertinent to the developers, it's pertinent to every like vertical slice of the organization, to like make sure that when someone says, a user, they mean a user and not just a specific role of a user or what the, engineering class for a user means, or, just making sure that everyone is kind of on the same page to help, make iterations on it easier, or for someone to pick it up easier, or just any aspect of the whole chain.
Another thing you had touched on, kind of like code being well organized and like following like URL structures, like say on a web application, having that kind of match down to the on the code level. Are you often working with any frameworks or anything like that to help you with that are kind of opinionated in that nature?
I wouldn't say anything that forces that opinion. I currently work in an Angular JS application where we do enforce it via like a routing system, and the routing system tends to match to the name of the module that it's living in.
Yeah, I know that was like a big thing, kind of an aha moment back in the days when I would say first saw like Ruby on Rails back in like 2005. It was just like, oh, this makes sense. If we could it just magically does this stuff if you just follow these conventions. And so I know that not all frameworks and platforms are kind of enforcing that, but it definitely does think having some consistency there, it definitely helps make things easier to make, at least it helps it make it obvious where to first look, I suppose, for the code that matches what you're trying to make a change to.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think it's been something to like ease the developer flow, like especially when you come back to something that you haven't touched on in months or years, where the name of a module, the name of a route, like all like every piece of that kind of like shares the same naming convention. So that way you're not like trying to hunt for a module in a directory that, has nothing to do with it.
That makes sense. Were those kind of conventions in that particular project already set before you got there? Or if not, were you part of the conversations around kind of defining those?
Some later stages I was. A lot of the Angular conventions got started before I started working on them, especially for like how we approached the naming and like the organization of them. And some of them have kind of happened while I've been working on it, as we do like almost like a second revision on like older code, or trying to embrace newer patterns as we build out newer functions.
I know that something, in preparing for this conversation, you had shared that you have some, your experience dealing with dependencies, and in particular outdated dependencies in applications, let's say with examples of like where they no longer work with newer runtimes. Could you elaborate a little bit on what like some examples of that?
Yeah, so I think one of the points I was talking about was a internal application that it's a chatbot, and it's built on top of what I would now consider like unmaintained Hubot framework from GitHub, and it was built on older CoffeeScript. There's kind of like this weird forced dependency on the older CoffeeScript by the Slack adapter, and a lot of issues have been filed. They're like, hey, can we like finally move to the new, Hubot Slack to like the newer coffee version? And the answer's kind of like been a no. And that kind of led me down the path of like, all right, maybe I should like start sunsetting pieces of this framework and get off of it entirely. And it's just, we've ran into some issues where older modules will have implemented something that was deprecated in a later version. And because of like how you're like injecting modules from an NPM package, you don't really have as much control over it as you would if you hosted it yourself within the code base. And then a lot of referring back to the fact that a lot of things were injected from modules is when packages go unmaintained, like you now kind of either have the option of maintain a copy yourself or drop it.
When that happens, when let's say a module is no longer maintained, it's an interesting thing that I've had a lot of different varying thoughts about over the last few years, because I oversee like people on my team, for example, will be looking at potentially. We work with Ruby on Rails primarily, and so they'll be looking at a Ruby gem or exploring some options of different Ruby gems. And we often work on older applications too, so they might be running on an older version of Rails. So we might need to look for some gems that work against older version of Rails, but there's also this like worry of, well, this particular gem hasn't been seen any activity on it on GitHub or GitLab in a couple of years now, so it's no longer maintained. It's maybe considered not safe to use that. Would you say that's accurate, or?
Yeah, sometimes you don't want to have to take over the maintainer ownership, because that means now you're the one responsible for that package, assuming it's still being used. As for whether things can or cannot be safe, it like can depend on what the package is actually doing. Like sometimes there are packages that you have that are like self-contained, and they themselves don't sit on top of, the ever-growing tree of dependencies. Those can tend to be a little bit more safe. But if it's something that's like, it's an unmaintained package and it has just a longer list of dependencies underneath of it, that's definitely where you get into like that hairy like zone of you're like, all right, maybe, we should try to find something else, or perhaps roll our own internal version based off of this that can be more in line with like the modern runtime.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I like that idea of like assessing what other packages or dependencies that particular dependency might be carrying along for the ride, because sometimes we'll need a dependency for maybe like an API call client or something like that, or maybe just to perform even some really much smaller task for like Markdown. I don't know, but depending on like the situation that you're dealing with, like you pull in these packages, it has its own set of dependencies. Those potentially have their own dependencies, and so you're bringing in one thing, but then a couple years down the road, you're like, oh, now we're dealing with some weird version conflicts between a couple different, because we do need this one version that we're heavily reliant on, but there's another dependency that's we're not able to bump up for whatever reason. And that one has a dependency hard-coded to an earlier version, and now we're kind of like trying to map that all out. And so that can be, as you said, like a hairy situation. But if you can find dependencies that are more self-contained, that can be good. The thing I'm always like trying to remind people on my team, for example, is just like, well, we can definitely heavily lean on the work that the other people have done already. We may not need to like pull that dependency, but as you said, you could bring over some of the ideas or concepts. You could literally just sometimes even bundle it into your, whether or not that's a good idea, but you can sometimes copy and paste some pieces of it to get what you need out of it, and then that's okay as an approach as well. But do you and your team talk about this a lot about like what? Is there like any decision process that the team makes, or do all the developers kind of have some liberty on picking dependencies and pulling them in and just assuming that would just get sorted out in a pull request type process?
Typically, we don't just let people just go and pull a package in just to solve a problem. There is usually some sort of vetting procedure or a discussion had, or as long as we are referring to trusted sources depending on the project. But yeah, we typically want to avoid the just, npm install away a problem, because it can incur more security holes, or just, I'm coming from that school of a JavaScript developer where when people started npm installing away problems, I was like, I don't want to do this. This doesn't make sense. And now I'm like, all right, we'll go through a series of digging through NPM, trying to find what's modern, what's actually maintained, and what the level of depth I have to go to look at every dependency. Because if it's something that I can either cherry pick out the piece I need, or sometimes, if it's a larger library, something that does image magic, or something that's a little bit more processing heavy, you might not have an option. But yeah, typically in a work scenario, we do a lot of vetting before just installing a third-party package to resolve a problem.
Yeah, I'm always curious how often teams have those types of conversations, and on some level, people, even an individual developer on a team is vetting it to a degree, but it's hard. Sometimes you don't always have that experience of knowing just how much it could, that trade-off. It might be really quick right now to use it, but 2 or 3 years down the road, it might become a huge mess for you to untangle and sort out later. But sometimes that can help you get where you need to be quicker too, right? So that's it's an interesting trade-off that we have to make to produce some code or release some features that that the product team is pushing for. So where does things like testing come into play with that? Do you spend a lot of time working on writing tests around to account for whether or not these dependencies may change?
Actually, no, but now that you mention it, probably should. We tend to not write tests to test the dependency, but when we write testing, we want to make sure that whatever our interaction with it is still happening as expected. And that kind of goes back to the whole, you want to trust that a package is vetted itself. If you're spending time writing tests for another person's, package, then probably should have just written it yourself at that point.
That's fair. It's an interesting thing, because it's even with APIs, they sometimes change, and you might have missed an email or two that got sent out about some incoming changes, and so you don't find out until something's broken or something. And I feel in general that's been a lot less of an issue now in the last few years than it was, say, 10 to 15 years ago. But I carry that sort of baggage still as a software developer, that I don't trust other things sometimes, but I also don't have the time to just write tests for every single potential little edge case that could happen. You have to kind of pick your battles there. I'm curious what sort of things that your team does try to focus, and where you would like to see your team, maybe as another question there, whether or not you want to dig into that. I don't want to call you or your team out on anything if you feel there's a disconnect there, but what is ideal for testing, especially given that you're working on, say, front end stacks in the Angular and that area, which is a little bit different than where I'm typically working.
Actually, we're a full stack shop, so it's a big mess of PHP for the back end and Angular up front. Not mess, but it's just we're all over the place in terms of what libraries and frameworks we're using. And We do have a heavy emphasis on end-to-end testing and integration testing, especially for like more of our modern APIs, to make sure that the expectations are what we are actually expecting them to be. And it has actually helped catch some things before going to production where we released a new API and we're getting ready to push it out, and some like minor detail like just gets missed, and like luckily that just by having that assertion of an API endpoint like responding correctly can cause a blow up in staging and not in for a user.
Is that with that type of using PHP and Angular? Are those managed as separate projects, separate teams, or do you do any sort of like atomic commit type approach to deploying everything at once, or you're able to kind of piecemeal the deployments out?
It's we're all responsible for features that go across the entire stack. We do have the ability to do like the atomic commit where we can like say release the API separate from the front end, which is super helpful. Whatever you like, let's say you want to stop the API from responding with something, or you change the interface, but like the front end doesn't know about it yet, or like no, we're a full stack shop. I know some people don't like to use that word, but
I'm okay with the word.
Okay, great.
I think it's been where that particular title thing has come up. It's been interesting for me to try to wrap my head around it because I'm not sure exactly how long you've been in the industry, but I feel like the concept of what a front end developer has evolved over the years, and full stack came into play. And I feel like it can be a little confusing at times for some people to know, like, well, am I a front end developer or a full stack developer? Is there a half stack developer? Is a little cheeky answer.
Right. You mean like, yeah, recently the whole concept of you have the front of the front and then the back of the front, and then like, I mean, I think just the back is still like typically it's like, oh man, like now I'm thinking about this. Yeah, like you have the front end, which can also has a back end to it, but then that back end talks to an API, which is what was traditionally the back end.
We have trouble. I think what we're learning is it's hard to name things in every facet of our world. We'll be back with our interview with Michael in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you. Thank you so much for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, do you know someone that I should be interviewing with on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to Robby with a Y at maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Michael Springer. Do you believe that teams underinvest in the documentation?
I mean, I think that's as a whole, people probably have a tendency, especially at just from experience at like different organizations, documentation has always been like a afterthought sometimes. Not like saying that my team underinvests in documentation. I'm just saying like as a general experience sort of thing, where I've been at organizations where I found out we had a wiki when they were deleting it. But it's just like a lot of organizations, and it kind of like stinks to think about this, but like documentation has to kind of be like a cultural level sort of thing. Otherwise, you just kind of rely on tribal knowledge. That's it. Where it's like, oh, you have a question about this part of the API, go talk to this guy, or this person knows more about this feature than anyone else, and that can be great in the short term, but in the long term, you can find yourself getting bitten by that whenever people leave.
Yes, it's the challenges of it's almost like relying on that real-time communication to talk about those things. Like, oh, I have a question about this, or you become really reliant on the history of like your Git, what's in the Git logs or Git blame or your ticketing system if you haven't changed that a few times over the years, and whether or not you've retained older versions of things. I don't know how often you go back and look at previous versions of code. I I feel like we're spending a lot of time looking at the current state of things and trying to comprehend things, let alone trying to go back and figure out how things used to work 5 or 6 years ago when some changes were first implemented. So we lean on those wise people that knew about the things back in the day until they, and then they leave, and then there's kind of that scramble to like, oh, I hope they can you document everything you know before you leave? And I know that can be seems like a nice idea in theory, but I think you probably lose out a lot of that information at some point. So what type of documentation do you find most valuable, or does it kind of depend on the scenario?
I do find it depends on the scenario. Like documentation that kind of breaks down like how something kind of like stitches together is really important, especially with systems that kind of abstract away things to the point where it's almost magical. Just trying to think. Documentation with strong examples is also like really valuable, but it kind of comes down to like making sure that like the code above all else like has contracts that are easily understood, and like you're not looking at like a function that just has like a single parameter in it, and then like now you have to like somehow like decode whether or not like that single parameter has 10 sub properties to it. So it's kind of like a mix where it's like you want stuff written down in like a wiki or a readme somewhere, but it does kind of come back to like the code itself needs to be well written and structured in a way that like I can like maybe putz through things a bit, look at a previous like release tag to see like what was added and like get an idea of like we added a implementation of this API endpoint. Well, like now I have like a general idea of like the full slice for setting up like that kind of API endpoint.
Right. And I'm curious, on that, thinking about different types of documentation, and it kind of depends, like you were touching on whether things go into a wiki or the code itself being kind of conveying and being as clear as possible for people. And do you do a lot of inline commenting in the type of work that you're doing, or do you tend to rely on just the verboseness of how you're writing out the syntax?
Little bit of both. If I look at the code and like I come back to it a day later and I can't, really tell what it's doing here, or if there's like a conditional that like it makes sense at the time and it is required for something to happen, like I'll throw in like a little, inline comment that says, hey, this needs to be here because blah, or like this is where we're checking for XYZ condition.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just reflecting on a guest that I had on a while back named Tudor Gerba, who was sharing some statistics about software developers, and I just want to kind of get your thoughts on this, where they've done some studies and they've kind of assessed that developers spend more than 50% of their time reading code. Does that sound about right to you?
I'll be honest, yeah, that does sound a bit right. Like the other day I like spent maybe like a few hours on a work task, and I looked at like the end result, and I'm like, how did that much time go into just like what ended up being like maybe 10 lines of code? And it's like I had to like go through, read the code, try to find like a strong example of like what I'm implementing, look at what the interfaces are requiring, see if there's any like previous comments on like a GitHub PR, or if there's like an inline doc block relating to this. But yeah, like it definitely feels like a lot. You spend more time, at least half of your time, reading the code before you even like just implement something.
So you would agree that developers shouldn't be paid based on the number of lines of code they produce?
Oh my God, no. That's like, I mean, if that's the case, I owe my company a lot of money. Given like, I think I just committed something where I deleted like more code than I added. So
Oh, you are a saint. Thank you for that. Even though I don't work there, I appreciate that. We don't spend enough time deleting unused or outdated code, which is another thing I often wonder is like, do teams, you mentioned like teams, it's a cultural thing whether or not they're investing a lot of time in documentation. And I think one thing that I've noticed is there's been a trend towards celebrating removing code that's like dead code, but I don't hear enough. And this is something I'm just trying to like spread the new gospel of like deleting outdated documentation, feeling comfortable enough to get rid of that as well, because I think there's always a fear like, well, if we get rid of it, then we might not be able to reference it again in the future, but like archive it, delete it, whatever. Just because also another problem with documentation is if there's a lot of irrelevant documentation that's not terribly helpful to anyone either. Like, well, that's outdated. If no one's updating it, then is outdated documentation helpful, or is it adding more noise and or potentially conveying to the new people that you're bringing into your team that you don't value grooming, let's say, or gardening or cleaning up the weeds and stuff like that as well. I think that should apply to documentation as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I know I've personally experienced someone coming to me about like a piece of documentation, and I just had the oh crap response, because like they're like, oh, this is not even like this is outdated and the completely wrong version of the documentation because it got moved somewhere else. And yeah, definitely something to I agree that like definitely needs to be more of a cultural thing to not just add documentation, but also like prune it as well.
Prune your documentation, everyone. So I know you worked on a number of projects, and on say like your team has like hack days and such, and that later became projects you needed to kind of take care of on a day-to-day basis at work as part of your responsibilities. Can you share some examples, or do you have a story? I know you mentioned like the chatbot. Is that one of those types of projects?
Yeah. So the chatbot kind of predates me actually. It was at the company before I was. It was one of those setups where someone threw a Hubot instance on Heroku back when you could just have a free API living out in the wild, as was the norm at the time. And as like a hack day thing, I was like, oh man, I really want to like add more functionality to this thing. It was kind of like a non and immediate response, but like eventually more functions started to be less fun and like jokey, and actually like, hey, what's deployed to this staging environment? Like which version, who did it? And the functions started to become more things to ease developer, or I guess improve developer quality of life. Deploying like a piece of code went from being knowing how to like check all the boxes and fill out all the forms on a Jenkins build screen to just saying, I want to deploy to staging with this branch. And it's like one of those things is like eventually became a responsibility, and like started trying to find a way to like formalize the process around it.
Those are always kind of fun projects. I'm trying to remember back. It's been a while since I've done anything like that myself, but I'm remembering team members and even myself way back in the day doing things like that, where you'd work on these fun little things and like, oh, now this is kind of shown to prove more value to the team or what have you. And some of those, we still have some projects that are running day to day that help that, developers that haven't been here in 5 years ago worked on, quite a while ago. Do you often start off those types of projects thinking like, oh, it'd be really cool if we could do this to help the team? Or is it like you want to scratch an itch to do something, and then sometimes they just kind of manifest into something else?
Yeah, I think they tend to be like scratch an itch, like, oh man, it'd be really cool if like our admin panels in the application had this information, because it's something that people ask for all the time, or it's like a really big time sink to hunt down, but like we know a quick way to like provide a query for it, or just like a lot of those. Yeah, it's definitely like scratching the itch kind of thing, and especially if the itch becomes bad enough that you're like, all right, I'm gonna like sit down 5 minutes, just hammer this out, see if it actually works, and then like what the response is to that thing existing now.
Do you feel like if you do that now, you have a different set of filters on whether or not you're going to scratch that itch versus like go look for some third-party tool or something?
Typically, if it's like something that would require a third party, that definitely has to go through like a lot more filters and systems and approval chains. So typically the itches that I know I personally try to solve tend to be things that like I can use existing systems that we have or integrate with existing systems to provide a better experience internally, which doesn't require as many filters, but more recently it's been, it went from me doing things on my own and people going, that's cool, to, all right, let's maybe talk about this and like whether or not that's a good add as functionality.
It's interesting. I think I've personally become very hesitant to, for better or for worse, when I have people on our team, they're like, ooh, like let's build our own little, like, to say, chat tool to automate our deployments or something. And like if someone on the team were to say that now, I'd be like, are there some tools we could just take advantage of for that before we build it ourselves? Because I'm more nervous as someone that knows about the long-term impact of those projects, where like we have a couple projects that, as I said, were built years ago by people that most people on the team now haven't really worked on. And so I'm like, okay, I know how much time we've invested into that tool. And maybe at the time, but it's like there's that balance of like sometimes those tools become part of like your team's operational functionality, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, with like needing to sunset pieces of your project or your dependencies or something like that, there also sometimes needs to have those conversations like maybe we need to sunset that thing we built ourselves because there's a perfectly viable solution that we can pay for off the shelf that we're not really responsible for taking care of anymore. So it's like, it's not, I'm for better or for worse, have become fearful of the long-term cost of maintaining that software, even if it's a small itch to scratch seemingly today, because I know that in like 6 to 10 years, if it survives, then it's something that we're now responsible for. Do you feel like you've had any of that sort of kind of conclusions over the years?
Yeah, typically it's the filters of other people responding, okay, like that's a good idea, but we're going to approach it a little differently. And that definitely helps towards like the overall maintainability. So like kind of going back to like the whole like chatbot to do deployments, like our chatbot doesn't actually do the deployment. It's just like a proxy to the actual deploy system. So that way, if the bot goes away, we're not completely hosed. And if we want to change the deployment system, the bot doesn't have to necessarily also go away either.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
So a couple of topics I like to ask most people on the show, and one of them is, do you find yourself more often on team rewrite or team refactor?
Yeah, I tend to lean towards the team rewrite, typically because it's the approach of a second iteration on things. And oftentimes when you try to refactor, you have to dance around any tech that you might have incurred previously. The chance to rewrite is sometimes a little bit alleviating, where you're able to simplify some sort of like module or interfaces or an abstraction that was not necessary, or maybe you've realized that you need to abstract something a little bit more. Whereas a refactor, when you're trying to like still play within the existing sandbox, can be a bit of a burden. Okay, so that's actually the approach that I've been taking with the chatbot at work. Has been, instead of just like doing a complete rewrite out the gate in order to maintain, it's still functioning day to day, but also wanting to like implement new bits as I go. We've been slowly rewriting like components at a time to the point where we're going to eventually be able to just discontinue use of like the core framework underneath.
Are there some strategies that you've seen work well for teams when they're exploring a rewrite to, let's say, set themselves up on a better foot for the next time around? Because I always wonder how teams start to kind of deal with the challenges of like, are some of the issues that we've incurred in this existing application because it's just the natural tendency of the software and how things evolve and grow and businesses grow, and so we can learn from that? Or is it some of that related to people and process that we never really nailed down, but if we get a fresh start again, we'll hopefully avoid it?
I know from personal experience, we did a rewrite project, and one of the things we did before we even wrote a line of code was we looked at the piece, like the components that we were replacing, and like why things were structured in a certain way, why there were like certain parts of the interface, why different classes and objects had properties on them, and whether there was a way for us to do this better. And like when we found things that were just added as a Band-Aid solution, we were trying to find ways to, like, if we could decompose it better in order to support that sort of case, or if there are things that are like in there that are no longer necessary, and now we have a chance to not have to write logic to support that, which definitely tends to be more of the common case when you're doing a rewrite, is you find that like there's a whole slew of functionality that you're like, oh, we don't even, like, no one's used this anymore, so we can actually just not have, we can like skip like an entire like chunk of the code base. That's
good. And in your environment, do you have some good statistics or data points to help kind of point in that direction? Like, because I talk to some developers and they're like, I have no idea if this area of the code ever gets used or not. Or we know that maybe like one customer uses it, but the other 99 probably don't even know it's there. But if we got rid of it, like that client would get upset with us. Do you have good metrics on things like that?
We been working towards building out better metrics around these sorts of things, and making sure that that's part of the end goal of a project. So like we do have the ability to look at like usage rates through different like analytics tools, be it through even a dashboard that looks at like the frequency of logs produced by like that piece of the code, or some sort of end user like heat mapping tool, or
Interesting. A topic I usually try to cover with people as well. When technical debt is identified amongst your team, do you feel like you have a pretty consistent process as a team on how you determine whether or not you're going to address it in the near future versus someday maybe? And how do you organize that type of work?
We tend to organize it through, like, we'll have refinement processes, like a series of grooming meetings where we'll like look at bugs that have been filed or issues that have been like coming in through our support system, and see like if it's like, something that's super frequent, then like that gets prioritized. But if it's something that happens like once in a year, then it might get discarded outright. And because it's like, all right, well, we have a project upcoming anyway, so we're just gonna hold off on that a little bit longer, and it's gonna get removed in like 6 months.
That sounds like you have a healthy approach to that there. And so for those listening, let's say that there's a developer out there listening who works on a team where they don't feel like their team has those conversations often enough, and maybe they've raised like some concerns of like, well, this feels like a messy area of the code, but or this identifying some technical debt, and they want to address it, but they didn't really get some like thumbs up in the past. Maybe let's invest some time there. What advice could you offer them on how to like kind of approach their peers and or product owner on how to like prioritize some time there to look into these issues to smooth things out?
I think one thing is to definitely be able to like provide a good case for it. In one example I was able to provide a search for our logging system, and like, hey, this error has come up like 83 times in the last year. That's been really annoying to our end users, and it could have been resolved by us doing, one thing. I think it just kind of comes down to being able to provide a good case. Like, sometimes like we feel like, oh, you say like, hey, this needs to be fixed up. That's not always like a strong enough case. In my personal experience, I've had to deal with yes, we should clean it up, but there's not a good like business case for it. And as an engineer, you're like, how is there not a business case? It's part of the application. Like that's enough business case for me. So I think it kind of like comes down to if you're able to like, if it's something that like you see and you're like, all right, this is definitely a problem. If you're able to like help provide a good story and like a narrative around why, and like maybe even a how to approach cleaning it up, that can definitely help encourage others to see your point of view, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, that's some good advice there. Like thinking about how you can, you reference even pulling in some data points, present your case there and such as well. Yeah, that's helpful. And also knowing that there are times when there's some smaller amounts of technique that like we could probably live with, maybe it only happens a few times a year. So like, do you think that every bug in an application needs to be resolved or squashed?
I'm not sure if I'm going to catch hell for this. No, but it's a, like not every bug. It's like, yes, it'd be great to like squash every bug that comes up, but sometimes the bugs are like, I don't want to be like it's a feature. Sometimes a bug needs to be not so much squashed as it is like you need to put some like sort of exception handling or logging around it, because it's like the noise that can come up sometimes from like an error happening can help inform other things, such as someone doing a thing that they really shouldn't be able to do. And if that's either by like the system getting circumvented in some way, or you didn't put enough safeguards in, like it's sometimes you do need to leave the bugs in just for a bit, maybe to get a full picture as like what's really happening, as opposed to like we saw X come up, got to fix it, but it's like, well, why did that happen? So like sometimes it's good for them to stick around, and sometimes they'll just like, they're not high enough priority to like even bother with.
For what it's worth, I agree with that. I think sometimes you need that context of like, why is this bug being triggered? But I also want to be wary of teams like getting to a scenario. It's like, well, let's wait on looking into bugs because we don't know if it's a serious bug, or not all bug tracking software can like help point you in the right direction of how severe of an issue it is, right? Sometimes it could be like that, we got hit once, but it was just a huge issue, or just because we think it's in a certain area of the code base, we need to like look at that sooner. I think every team needs to figure that out probably and understand what's important or not.
I wouldn't say like not to just outright ignore bugs. I definitely think it's worth doing the due diligence to triage, like actually like see what's going on, and like to find out if it's like an internal user like using a legacy API endpoint that like, yeah, it exists, but like it's also kind of on them to like make sure that they input it correctly because it's supposed to be there, whether it's actually like oh crap, we just deployed this and it's legitimately an issue, and to the user like they don't really see it as a big issue, but then like let's say it's like a user does a thing and like they see like an error modal, but then they refresh and everything's fine, and then you find out that it's like just been generating tons and tons of orphaned records in your DB, and you're about to deal with something maxing out.
Yeah, that's no good. Yeah, definitely pay attention to those things. So, a couple of quick last questions. Is there a non-technical, non-software development related book that you often find yourself recommending to peers?
One that's I was recommended heavily and spent a good deal reading was Deep Work. I have a personal problem of focus, and I know lots of other people in this field do as well. It definitely helped me get some ideas around what it meant to like really approach work, and like the idea behind shallow versus deep work. Definitely something valuable to people outside of software in general. You could, if you're a writer, I think there's actually a lot of good examples of academics in the book.
Excellent. I'll definitely include a link to that in the show notes for all the listeners. And where can those listening best follow your thoughts on software development online?
Oh no. I do have a Twitter, although it is mostly dedicated to hobby work instead. There will be the occasional software thought leak out. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce my Twitter handle. Yeah, it's Springer without vowels.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, definitely. There'll be a link for everybody in the show notes there. Well, with that, Michael, it's been such a delight having you join us today on Maintainable. Thanks for talking shop with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.